Today at shopdapp.com, we're doing a front wheel bearing on our MK5 GTI. All right, so our first step is going to be to remove the axle nut here, or axle bolt on this particular car. We've removed the center cap from the wheel already so that we can get access to this bolt with it on the ground. That'll keep it from turning everything when we do it. All right, now that that is loose, we can go ahead and get the car back jacked up. Now that the axle is loose, we can go ahead and remove the wheel. Our next step is to remove the two bolts on the back side that are holding the caliper to the spindle so that we can go ahead and remove this brake rotor. So these are 21mm bolts. And they're usually pretty tight. Okay, so now that that's been loosened, we can go ahead and take these bolts out. All right, now that those have been removed, we can go ahead and pull the caliper off, which will just slide off. And you don't want to let this hang by the brake line. So we've gone ahead and hung this out of the way with bungee cord. So now to remove the brake rotor, we remove our set screw, which is a T30 Torx. And then you may need to hit the brake rotor with a rubber mallet or some sort of hammer to break it loose. Sometimes it's harder than others. If you're really gonna wail on this thing, a good idea is to thread in a wheel bolt or two, so if it does break loose, it doesn't go shooting across the floor or onto your feet, which is usually a bad time. That's normal if you do have to do that to get that off. There's a lot of corrosion and stuff gets stuck behind there. And now we can see our hub and wheel bearing. This is all one piece and will come off together. So when you have this off, you can wiggle it and feel if there's any sort of play in this, which there is, which is a sign of a bad bearing. And that's what causes the noise you get associated with a bad wheel bearing. Now that we've got the rotor off, we can go ahead and pull out our axle bolt. And then we pull off the nuts for the ball joint. We can pull the whole spindle out some and get the axle splines separated from the actual wheel bearing itself. So now we can pull off these ball joint nuts. They are 16mm. And this will allow us to pull the control arm down some and pull this whole spindle out of the axle out of the spindle rather. Just like that. And that gives us access to the triple square bolts that are back here that hold the wheel bearing hub assembly into the spindle. The next step is to remove these triple squares that we just gained access to. They are 12mm triple squares. And when you have this ball joint pulled out, you get a lot of room to kind of maneuver this around. So it is pretty helpful to do that. Okay, got our last bolt out, and then the wheel bearing now should come out. Because of the rust and stuff on here, it doesn't always necessarily just pop out, but it's not being held by anything anymore. All right, so now that we've got this out, this particular car is actually from Northern Virginia, so it's seen some salty winters and everything like that. So we actually had to remove this spindle and get this pressed out. Normally that is not what you have to do on these. Normally you can remove the bolts, then tap this out with a hammer, and it should come out with just a little wiggle in, maybe a little couple taps to pop it out, and it should come out fairly easily. Now, this one, like I said, was from Northern Virginia, so it had a bunch of rust and stuff in here that we did have to deal with, but not anything we can't overcome. So now that we've got that old wheel bearing out, in hub, we can put our new one in, and it just goes right in the same spot. Nothing too crazy here. And since there is a little bit of rust in there, like I had just mentioned, it needs to get just tapped in with a mallet. You want to make sure, if you are going to tap it in, that you try and do it fairly evenly on all sides. Okay. Once we got that seated, we can take our bolts, which the kit does include new bolts. Go ahead and get them started on the back side. So these bolts that are provided with the bearing that we sell, which we will link to in the description, do have Loctite on them. So they will not be something that you'll be able to just thread in by hand. So like I said, you want to try and go evenly on these until the bearing is pulled all the way in. That way it gets a good seat in there and doesn't, have the opportunity to get cockeyed or anything like that in there. So we've got our new bearing on. Now we can go ahead, get this pulled back out and get the axle in here. So the axle has splines that match up with the splines in the wheel bearing or the hub. So once they get lined up, it goes right in, and you can get your axle bolt in right after. So now that we have the axle back in here, you'll be able to look in the hole here. You probably won't be able to see it on camera, but you'll be able to see where the end of the axle and the splines, everything like that match up. You'll know that you're most of the way in there, and then it'll get pulled the rest of the way in when we torque the new axle bolt. So we go ahead and thread that in there for right now. We will torque that once we get this car back on the ground, because it is very tight and is not something that we will be able to tighten with it in the air like this. So now that we have that, go ahead and put our brake rotor back on. So you want to make sure when you put this on that all the holes line up And then the hole for the set screw, which keeps this rotor from turning on the hub, lines up as well. So go ahead and put that screw in here. And this will help hold the rotor in while we put the caliper back on. This bolt screw does not need to be particularly tight. All that will do is make your life harder when you go to put brake pads on. Now that that's done, we can come back down here, get our ball joint back into our control arm. Just like so. Get our bolts back on, or nuts rather, I'm sorry. Now that those are run up, we can go ahead and make sure that they are tight by hand. And you don't want to go crazy on these things. We'll put the actual torque spec up on the screen here, but you don't want to go crazy because you can break these studs. And then you need to replace the whole ball joint, which is kind of a pain. You have to pull the axle back out to get everything done correctly. Now we take our caliper that we had bungeed up top, put it back on. And you may need to actually spread the pads a little bit to get it back on. It may make your life a little bit easier depending on how yours was when you came apart, life of your pads, things like that. One thing you definitely want to note when you do drive this car, if you got it put back together, that you're going to want to pump the brakes a couple times before you start driving. Because of the way the slop is from the pads being displaced, you're going to have a pretty spongy pedal if you don't do that. Now that those bolts are in, go ahead and tighten them up. All right, our last step before putting the wheel on is to go ahead and get this torqued down to its initial spec, which this is 70 Newton meters plus a 90-degree turn. What I like to do is just put a screwdriver here in the end of the rotor. That will keep it from turning on you as you tighten this. And then the 90-degree turn that you get at the end here makes this very tight. Usually it's easiest to leave the center cap off the wheel like I showed you when we loosened this bolt. Get this torqued to that, and then put this on the ground, have the car in park with the parking brake on. We can get that last 90-degree turn. Now we'll go ahead and get these wheels torqued. And our final step of tightening this axle bolt, the remaining 90 degrees. All right, now we're all set. Lastly, we can go ahead and pop in our center cap and put our wheel caps in. All right, guys, thanks a lot for watching. My apologies if this DIY isn't as good as one of the ones that Paul usually does, but hopefully it's enough to get you through it. This was how to install a wheel bearing on a MK5 GTI. If you like this video, want to see more like it, be sure to like, subscribe, do whatever it is Paul usually tells you to do. Click wherever.